how did the nations form? And we might also ask why, in most cases, nations formed within the separate states. And the question is even more interesting because even certain states that arguably were part of the same nations and at some point even were aiming to unite might, in many cases, when they stay as separate states enough, might just start to think or believe that they are separate nations. So, as I said, the sense of identity uh, between certain groups was certainly there existing, although that sense of identity might to some extent also, well, even in states which we might think as nation states, for example, Spain, um, in the Basque region, the sense of identity might be separate from the rest of the nation. For example, those cases also exist, or in even in Catalonia, the Barcelona area. Uh, so the main idea how this nation sense of nation was formed is the increase between the interaction uh, of the people in the in a state, usually organized by a state with common education system, uh, increasing transportation, increasing economic interaction between them. At this, especially at first, between the major cities, then between towns, increasing also between the uh, even villages. Similar cultural elements, like for example, soccer teams, soccer leagues that everyone follows, or festivals everyone joins. Um, so all of these things uh, increasingly spreading to the national level. For example, Thanksgivings, well, certain local festivals, that are reinforcing local identity might uh, be there, but increasingly these elements of national identity also start to spread throughout the states and increasingly uh, throughout all people living in the state. As a result, this sense of identity starts to develop between different ways. I mean, the way we live in, the culture we share, our economic system, uh, our politically the people who are politically responsible to each other. They people start to think that basically people living under particular states share those elements. As a result, this lead to formation of the what we call nation state. Uh, so nations spread all the way to the states like England, France, Germany, Spain, uh, United Nations, or United States. I'm sorry, Brazil, uh, Turkey, India. Well, in very rough summary, this is how the states are formed. Um, and in states like Turkey, the Germany, England, France, this former sense of identity played a role in the formation of the nation, which extended nation's history all the way back when this identity was there. Identity of being Turkish, basically, or German, or Italian was there. In other nations like United States or Brazil or Mexico, the identity was basically formed from the former um, relatively weaker sense of identity, which exists, for example, between the tribes, as I mentioned before. Rather, because United States or Brazil or Mexico, based on people who did not actually share that identity before the formation of these countries. So basically, they formed an identity through the principles, principles on how a society should function according to them, and to some extent also common values on basically the relation between the people within the society. So, what is the role of state in all this? Well, and states should have a role in nation building, since basically nations have built mostly upon the border lines, within the border lines of the states. Well, basically, states create common institutions. Well, initially, at the very old ages, they were creating infrastructure and some religious supporting certain religious organizations, basically, and also provide some relief at the time of disasters, provide security with the armies, at least to the major centers, usually not to the villages. Villages can be pillaged anytime by anyone, even pirates, but not the towns offer some security. However, as we come to 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, states increasingly start to have other functions like regulating the economic system through central banks, creating a common education system, supporting economic institutions, well, kind of creating common cultural elements in time, like creating a soccer league or some supporting, for example, national literature, national arts, national science institutions. So it creates the framework through which the people of a nation can cooperate with each other. Well, in time, maybe even before states actually, more than states, or before states actually formed certain institutions, for example, financial institutions, people of that are living within certain states might also be forming certain institutions like newspapers, like trading. I mean, stock exchange, for example. That might be be increasing cooperation between the people of that nation. Anyway, so certain elements that form cooperation are formed independent of states or without actual direct action of states. Although states still might protect those institutions, at least in terms of, I mean, if there are any problems or violations in the in the stock exchange agreements made by one party, then they might intervene. So states might still support those institutions, even if they don't form those institutions. Even if certain institutions are formed by the people of the living under states. And in time also, of course, gradually, not in England, for example, it take all the way to 20th century for even, I believe, majority of the population to vote. So basically, but in time, increasingly, people start to get the viewpoint that state belongs to them. They are the ones that are controlling, regulating the state. Democracy has played a role in it, but also increasing the states, the heads of the states, even in a relatively less democratic country, starts to claim that state is actually belonging to the people. It's not just the property of a family or a elite class, basically. Now, this is formation of states. Actually, I mean, how the different elements, different people, different institutions, different even cities or communities living under a state start to get the view, the sense of belonging a single community with all its responsibilities, obligations, and rights. But when we look to it to other way around, what has separated, we might ask what has separated the states and nations. And in that way, especially when we consider that we are living under the economic, social, and political system mainly built by Europe, although certain countries like Eastern Asia and some Middle Eastern countries have their own traditions, which partially at least have survived. The European idea of sovereignty comes from the what can be called as Westphalian system. So before Westphalian system, if you go further back, you hit Roman Empire. So Roman Empire was a single empire which was ruling whole Europe and Mediterranean, basically. Then Roman Empire has collapsed, but this in the east, the Eastern Roman Empire has survived, which will gradually destroyed by different groups. In the West, the Western Roman Empire has collapsed, but the religious authority of the Western Roman Empire, the Church, survived. And there was a time, one or two centuries, where its authority in the borders of the Western Roman Empire was shattering. But then gradually all cities or countries in the old borders of Western Roman Empire and beyond Germany and Poland even start to agree its authority, the authority of the Rome as religious authority. And different countries, usually Germany, but at first France, then Germany, start to given the title of the emperor, Western Roman Emperor. Western Roman Emperor, in theory, was controlling whole Western Europe, whole Catholic world. In practice, they were not. Of course, England, France, they were all independent of the emperor. I mean, of course, this independence was seen as a semi-independence, and if any of the Catholic kings were to violate the basic laws, the basic, let's say, rules of the Catholic Christianity, the emperor had the primary duty of restoring the Christian order back to in those countries. So basically, you have very different countries, and then within those countries, many other feudal entities like princedoms, for example, which were semi-independent, autonomous, and you might say almost independent, but in theory they were not independent. In theory, you had a common Christendom, which was at the top of which you have emperor and the pope, the religious and the earthly authorities. Well, in 16th century, with the Reformation movement, and after this Reformation, this alternative forms of Christianity were accepted first by many princes and then by even some monarchs, like the English monarch. There was this huge war that lasted over 2 centuries, 16th and 17th century. And at the end of the war, there was an agreement which was called Westphalia Agreement. And Westphalia Agreement gives each prince and each state sovereignty. So they were to decide, not, previously the Catholic rules were the ones that should actually regulate the societies within the Western Europe. But now each prince and each state was the one to decide how to regulate, how to rule, how to decide internal matters of the country. and which form of Christianity to accept as their guidance.